Over to
Thank you. So quite a different presentation from what we've had, because I'm going to be talking about exhibitions. There'll be a lot of lovely photographs. Rich and I have been doing a lot of sort of very lengthy 1-hour presentations recently and tours of the exhibition going through each section. That's not what this presentation will be. You're probably grateful to know, but you can listen to Richard's got a recorded one on the website, so the British Museum website, so do listen to that if you want more detail. But really this talk is going to be about some of the challenges, but also the exciting aspects of choosing objects for exhibitions from an archaeological perspective. So I'm a small find specialist with an interest in the ordinary and everyday, and Richard Abdi, who's the lead curator of the exhibition, is a self-described coin nerd. So it was always a bit of a risk to bring both of us together and make us do a major exhibition, but someone thought it was a good idea. But essentially, in this talk, I'll show you a lot of lovely objects, but give you a bit of insight into what we wanted, how we went about it, what were the challenges, and where it hopefully has worked. Oh, amazing, thank you. Yeah, so starting off with some exhibitions and expectations. I've just got this really nice photograph from the opening as well of a really confused centurion looking at his matching cuirass and just determining his next project will be to recreate that one. But anyway, so obviously there's somewhat really obvious things about exhibitions. One thing is that it's obviously a great opportunity to revisit material. Sometimes material that's already in the galleries displayed, but hasn't really been looked at, doesn't get much attention. We know that visitors spend more time reading labels in exhibitions, paid exhibitions. So sometimes it's just an opportunity to take something, put it into a different context and let people have a look at it. Also material that's not on display, which you might think it's not on display for a reason, but not always, especially in the British Museum. So it's a great chance to show it off. Obviously a great chance to do new research. There's been increasingly a shift in academic interest towards focusing on the ordinary individuals and these more personal stories. But really the question that we had to deal with was whether that, academic interest translated to the public and whether the public was equally engaged. A few things on that and a few things on exhibitions. So some of the realities of what we had to deal with. Firstly, the increasing costs of exhibitions, costs of materials, anything that requires a new build, building a new display or bringing material from abroad is much more expensive now than it was even a couple of years ago. So it meant that we really had to justify anything that we wanted in the exhibition. It wasn't a kind of free-for-all, it was anytime you wanted any material. And so it made it particularly difficult to justify very small objects that were being flown in from, across Europe. And that's what we had to do. And sometimes we succeeded, sometimes we didn't. But also visitor expectations. So one thing that you get with the British Museum exhibition, which I had never experienced, is focus groups when you start planning the exhibition and when you're starting to choose your objects. And curators don't normally go to them for good reason, but I was very curious to see. And so I went, we always get the results. But essentially one of the questions that was asked was, with the increasing cost of ticket prices for exhibitions, what do you expect? If you pay £22 to go into an exhibition, what do you want to see? And very reasonably, people said that's a lot of money. I want to see really rare objects, things that I might not be able to see anywhere else. I want really exciting international loans. So I want to see objects that have never been to Britain before, I will probably never go to that country, so I want to see it in Britain. So there's quite a high audience expectation. And again, bringing in those, studs with the Millefiori, Hella, is, absolutely what we want to do, but is it what visitors are expecting when they go to an exhibition? And then, of course, balancing audiences. So people like British Museum members have quite different expectations from, for example, families and the types of objects and the types of stories that they want to hear, and how do you please everyone. And then finally, we're working with a team of designers. In our case, they were external designers, and the exhibitions team within the museum, which is amazing and absolutely tempered a lot of mine and Richard's crazier ideas. But there's a bit of a, sometimes there's a bit of a conflict between our inner archaeologist that wants to bring all the material in versus the exhibitions team that have perhaps a better idea of what will go down better with visitors. And it was always about finding a bit of an in-between. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some of the objects. This presentation was a lot longer when I first did it because I wanted to show you all the objects that we got. So I've had to limit myself, but hopefully as I speak through them, you'll some of these issues that I've mentioned will be clear. So really quickly, just the narrative behind the exhibition, or the idea behind the exhibition, was that we wanted to do an exhibition on the Roman army, but we wanted to tell the story from the perspective of ordinary soldiers and military communities. That's to say, this was never going to be an exhibition on militaria, even though militaria features, or on battles and great generals and emperors. It was always going to be told from the perspective of the ordinary soldiers and the military communities. That's to say, the women and children, but also the enslaved that travel with the army or live with the army. It has really quite a simple linear narrative that goes from enlistment to retirement. So we take the visitor on that journey from enlistment to retirement. And essentially acting a bit as the sort of spine of the exhibition to ground the visitor in the personal narrative and the perspective that we want of these ordinary soldiers, is the story of a real soldier, Claudius Terentianus, who quite remarkably, fragments of his letters home survive. And anything from sort of putting down a revolt to getting food poisoning and getting his pickaxe stolen and being bullied by other members of his unit. We try to weave in those stories into the objects, and actually where we include the stories is in the object labels. So it relies on people being interested enough in the object to read its label to get that extra level of insight. So how could we do this? How could we bring in the mundane, if you will, ordinary objects, and still keep visitors enthusiastic? We thought, let's combine things. Let's give people the exciting international loans and the rare objects that they want, and that we wanted too, obviously. But let's combine them with, almost like we're gently tricking the visitor into taking an interest in the thing that's right next to it, or that tells you a little bit more about that spectacular object, but maybe grounds you in reality a little bit more. So we'll start off with the Dura Europus shield, one of our most spectacular objects in the exhibition. It's in a section that we call Dressing for Battle, where we've reconstructed a bit of an armory, essentially, and you go in and you pick your shield, your helmet, your sword. It's probably the most sort of, militaria heavy section of the exhibition. And it really draws visitors. As soon as they see it, they go. I could do a 20-minute presentation just on the shield, of course, but I won't. It's a scutum, so a standard Roman legionary shield. It's the only surviving example that we've got. It's painted wood with sort of copper lining around the edges, and it's a really extraordinary example. It's actually missing its boss, which would have been in the center to protect the hand. So we've got it displayed with British Museum example, the lovely boss that normally sits in Gallery 49. So actually a really nice way of seeing this shield with a boss next to it, so you can see what's missing, but also a lovely opportunity of redisplaying the boss that we've normally got on public display, but never next to a real shield, so you can see it in context better. But when you go into the armory, sort of, bait you in with the beautiful shield, and then we keep you by giving you our armor. I apologize for the picture, but the galleries just seem to be full all the time, and trying to get pictures without shadows of people standing in the background is very difficult. But I can't take too much credit for this. When I suggested that I wanted to bring in an armorer's tools so we could tell the story of an armor and bring in, not just the soldiers, but the craftspeople, and also, soldiers could have had obviously other trades as well. I actually contacted Owen, who immediately suggested some great examples, because when I first suggested it, no one was convinced. Everyone thought, Roman tools, really? Can we sell those in a major exhibition? And Owen helpfully suggested the Waltham Abbey tools. They're sort of late 1st century BC, early 1st century AD, so they're just a little bit before our period maybe, and they normally actually sit in Gallery 50. They're a long-term loan from Epping Forest Museum. They're really lovely, but they sit on a sort of flat case, and actually until Owen mentioned them to me, I had not thought about them at all. So it was really nice to actually redisplay them in the exhibition in a bit more of an interactive way. And again, we wanted to engage people with what the objects or how they were used. And then just at the bottom from Tully House, we've got the sort of scraps and castaways, or Richard calls them the sweepings up of the Fort Armory in Carlisle. So again, kind of setting the scene. Again, not objects that would necessarily seem particularly exciting, but actually in context, it tells you a really interesting story about, you know, an important part of the army, which is of course their metalworking. So then we go into some of our, you know, trying to bring in what people wanted. One of the things in focus groups that happened was that whenever people were shown an array of objects to choose which ones they were most interested in hearing more about in the stories, they all went for busts. It was, you know, an imperial bust was immediately a draw, and that's because people recognize them as Roman, and they know what they are, but they want more context on them. Swords got a bit of attention, helmets got attention. Any of the other objects were just a bit, you know, they just sort of got overlooked. And anything with a face that didn't look like a beautiful classical marble statue also got overlooked. So we wanted to bring Julia Domna into the story. Julia Domna was, of course, the wife of Septimius Severus. She's very important to the military narrative that we're trying to tell. One, because she is a very famous example of a woman who traveled with her husband while he was on campaign. She was absolutely not the only one, let alone the only one who would have been hanging around forts in York, for example, where she was. But we wanted to introduce her first like this, in a way that visitors would recognize, but then to bring a bit of frontier reality, if you will, to the beautiful, but I think absolutely gorgeous, Julia Domna facepot from York. And would have been produced in the north of Britain. And again, even though we recognize the left as very Roman, or visitors certainly would recognize the marble bust of an empress as this imperial image, the right tells just as much of that story. And actually, for the purposes of the exhibition, it engages us more with what soldiers would have actually owned, you know, in their homes, as opposed to something they may have seen once. If, well, that Julia Domna is from Rome. So the other reason I really love this bust, and another story we bring out with it, is you can tell from her bust that she's wearing a wig. So there's wisps of hair coming out of the side that you might be able to see, and you definitely can't see with that in that photo, but she's also got bits of hair coming out the top of her wig. And Richard thinks she's sort of very candidly showing she's wearing a wig. Maybe that's a sort of military connection, that he's equating it with sort of a helmet. But one of the things that we do know is that soldiers also cropped their hair when they were on campaign and traveling because of the spread of lice and for hygienic reasons. It's very possible that Julia Domna did the same. And so this is where we bring from Vindolanda the lovely knit combs. This was another hard sell for the exhibitions team when I suggested bringing lots of knit combs into the exhibition. I think actually we got away with it because we've got a partnership with Horrible Histories, and it's, oh, this will go great with Horrible Histories, like talking about knits. But when I went up to Vindolanda to choose some objects, I had some objects in mind that I mentioned to Barbara. And knit combs were among them, but little did I know how many you actually had. And so obviously they're a really important part of that frontier life story, and they go into our fort life section. So battle, we do bring in battle, but again, we always wanted the visitor to, you know, instead of hearing about battles that they knew about and imagining, you know, the sort of historical battles they'd heard of, we wanted them to do that, but again, thinking about the soldiers and different stories we could tell. So we've got this fantastic cuirass that comes from Calclisa. It's the most complete, but only even near complete cuirass ever found. A new one may have just been discovered very recently. We're very lucky to have it because it was found in Calclisa and is in their museum and park. and they're building a permanent display for it. So we were initially told that we couldn't have it, but actually their permanent display is currently being built exactly as the exhibition is open. So we're really lucky to have it. And again, it filled this great, need for exciting international objects that people wouldn't get to see otherwise. But it also tells a really spectacular story. It's the analysis to the inside after the conservation showed that a body had decomposed, or they believe that a body decomposed within it. So there was a dead soldier in. So again, a very personal story. It's got this lovely detail where you can see the buckles, and you can see they were open. So actually you can go into even more detail and say that someone died in it, perhaps tried to undress themselves, or someone tried to undress them and take off the cuirass. We don't know. I won't go into all the theories. The Caucasia Museum actually put on a CSI exhibition about this whole discovery and their theories. We can talk about it at some point after the exhibition, or after the presentation, if anyone's interested in what their theories were. But this was a very easy sell to the exhibitions team. However, I had to fight very hard for a mule bell. This is not to scale compared to the cuirass, in case you're wondering. It's about this size. It had very specific environmental requirements as well, which made it quite difficult to bring over. It required its own case. But it tells a really interesting story. It comes from the same site. So this is the site of the Teutoburg battle, or the Varus disaster, as most people might know it, where 3 Roman legions were ambushed after the betrayal of Arminius, and they were ambushed by Germanic tribes and slaughtered. It's a very famous story for which many historical ancient authors wrote, very poetically about Tacitus, sort of skulls being nailed to trees and so on. But we want to tell these slightly more personal stories. And this mule bell was actually found to be stuffed with grass, showing that actually the Romans were trying to be quiet while going through enemy territory. And again, we wanted to paint that picture of what it was like being a soldier, and not just a soldier, because we know that women and children were traveling, and not to mention, of course, enslaved people would have been traveling with those legions as well. And just the fear that they might have been feeling, that just the obvious knowledge they had that they were going through enemy territory before they were slaughtered. So, a seemingly small, insignificant object actually tells a huge story. The analysis of the teeth of the mule, actually, which we also wanted to bring, but we did not get away with that one, showed that the mule had crossed the Alps twice. So it also tells us a bit about the travel of mules with the army, and how well traveled they could be, and how much how used they were, and how long they might have been used. This is one of my favorite objects, the dice tower. This is a beautiful bronze dice tower. It works exactly like a modern one, if anyone is familiar with them. You drop the dice in the top, then there's a few different levels inside that makes the dice roll. When it comes out through the steps, there's 3 little bells, only 2 survive, that ring to tell you that your result is in. And essentially, it's a as well as being a fun way to play games, it's actually a non-cheating device, because it forces the dice to roll. So it means that even if you've got a weighted die, you can't really get away with it. But perhaps more importantly, and one of the ways we got it in the exhibition, is it's got this wonderful inscription on the front, Pictos Victos Hostes Deleta Lutere Securite, which means the Picts have been defeated, the enemy has been, or hostiles have been destroyed, now play in safety. So a very interesting, militaristic inscription, and just another reminder that actually people had memorabilia that referred to sort of their military achievements, and that they might have been celebrating that even in their spare time. Also interestingly, this object comes from Bonn, and in Germany, but it is mentioning Picts. So again, who owned it? Where was it made and bought? Was it originally from Britain and taken to Germany? Was it someone who'd been in Britain but had it commissioned especially? We don't know. Thanks, perfect, thank you. Great, and just closing the exhibition, we've got some of my favorite objects in the exhibitions are these bronze military diplomas. And it was obviously, we were always going to have them, but they're quite difficult actually to present to visitors because they're essentially a sheet of bronze with writing on it that is very difficult to decipher. It's written on both sides, but the sides that we generally present have the text and then the witnesses on the other side. This particular one is the last object that you see in the exhibition. It's a bronze diploma from the Museum of Naples. It belonged to a man called Marcus Cyrus. And sadly, he retired and he got a diploma of citizenship. He was a non-citizen when he enlisted. He did his 25 years of service, which meant that he was gifted or granted citizenship. Unfortunately, he retired to Pompeii in AD 71. Not the ideal place to retire to. So enjoyed the retirement for about 8 years. But what's very interesting about the subject as well is that we found it in a workshop cubbyhole. So we actually display it with the Didcot hoard, which is about, give or take a coin, the equivalent of 10 years salary, which is what if you were a citizen you would get after your 25 years of service. So on the one hand, you get a payoff and basically a pension, but actually if you're not a citizen, you get citizenship. And if you're like Marcus Cyrus, you don't have a regular salary anymore. So what you have to do is go back to work, and you're working in a workshop again. So even after your 25 years, you don't really get retirement. But what you get is your children are now citizens and they won't have to go through the same. So thank you. I hope you come and see the exhibition.